we've been very fortunate on Money Talks to be able to call on Brian Gitt to really give us what I call the practical assessment, the realistic assessment. And I don't want to put words in Brian's mouth, but I think it's been wholly unrealistic. And now we're coming to a little more practicality. Companies, worried about their power source restricting any growth that they have. Countries, of course, doing that too in different regions, all of that. That's why I'm so pleased to welcome Brian back to the show. Brian, great to see you, first of all. And again, let me just, before we get anywhere here, I want to keep recommending your book that, you're the author of The Dark, Fixing Energy Policies That Hurt People and the Planet. And by the way, a totally nonprofit effort. Brian just did it because of his concern for what he was seeing around. So all you have to do is go to @BrianGitt and you can get order your copy of it. So Brian, as I say, I thought the book was excellent, but I thought it was timely too. Both of those things.
Well, thanks, Mike. It's always great to chat, and thanks for having me back on. I mean, there's so much been happening in the energy space, even since we last talked. And, the world is getting sober on a lot of these energy policies, and we're seeing it in real time, whether we're talking about big data center companies like Google and Microsoft and Amazon, to manufacturing and policies. So there's a lot to talk about.
And your background, of course, has been in clean energy for, 30 years. But you look young, so you probably started as a 4-year-old. But you've been doing it seriously for 30 years, starting with solar, with major projects in California, et cetera, and just your evolution as you demanded more practicality.
My evolution in thinking around various energy sources actually mirrors the human evolution of our story of energy, because when you think about it, since the beginning of time, humans, the arc of human progress has been following this trajectory towards more concentrated forms of energy. When we started with fire, then moved to agriculture, then we started with coal, basically, and the steam engine, and went to oil and gas, and then nuclear power. I'm kind of mirroring my own little personal journey on that. I started focused on energy efficiency and wind and solar and those types of renewable energies. And then over time, they've shifted to really embrace the benefits of hydrocarbons and nuclear power. So it's kind of a funny little mirror image of our history.
Going back just a moment to something you said, is that I'm always trying to measure the level of realism that's entered into that discussion, being one who thought it was just ridiculous. It was so wholly unreal. I mean, including, I think net zero is unreal without explaining the cost of net zero. As an example, again, I'm not putting words in your mouth, or whether we're going to go renewable and they forgot to mention that it was intermittent power with wind and solar, those kinds of things. Where do you think we're at on the practicality of it all, or has reality forced more practicality?
Well, I think reality is starting to set in. And I think if we step back for a minute, and what is energy? When we really think about it from first principles, what is it? Well, if you cracked open a physics textbook, it's going to say the capacity to do work. I would say there's even a obviously that's a correct definition, but I would offer an even clearer definition and expand upon that. Energy is freedom. Freedom from darkness, cold, hunger. It's freedom from drinking dirty water, from disease, and having the opportunity for economic prosperity that all of us want. And when you really start framing it through that lens, you really start changing your perspective. And I think that's what's happening in the world today, that more and more people are waking up to the various trade-offs of these energy policies. So for example, you see a lot of the big data centers and hyperscale cloud companies like the Googles, Microsoft, Amazons of the world. Well, for a long time, they had access to all the energy they needed, and they could hit their growth targets and hit their stock price earnings targets, et cetera. Well, all of a sudden, now that there's power scarcity issues in also this converging trend of moving and shifting to lower emission or cleaner sources of power, they're not able to grow. And so they're faced with this hard trade-off. Well, do we support building out more transmission and power generation capacity, or do we just stop growing? Well, I think everyone knows what the answer is going to be there. And this shows up over and over again when we're looking at energy policies in Europe or in the United States. When we're pressed against the wall, people want a better life. They want a better quality of life. And energy is the mechanism that enables all of modern life.
And you've been dealing this for several years, but again, more to the public's understanding or consciousness is the movement into nuclear. I mean, a very straightforward thing. Are we going to get what you've just described? The trade-offs are better. Are we going to get to, this AI revolution, for example? Or as you say, corporate companies are sort of getting restrictive. The power source is the key. So I've sort of sensed, obviously, and seen some progress in the whole nuclear debate. And I know you've been very closely involved with that.
Yeah, I mean, day to day, I work in the nuclear power industry. And so kind of I'm on the front lines working with these various customers, be it industrial companies, factories, data center companies, in working with them on negotiating these kinds of contracts. And so there is just tremendous, tremendous appetite and interest in this. Because honestly, there's not a whole lot of other good options. When you really step back and look at all the available options, are kind of suboptimal. So let's just kind of quickly go through them. Let's just take the United States as an example, but this isn't true in Canada and other places as well. So in the US, you're not going to be able to build more coal plants. In fact, the US EPA just a few weeks ago has finalized a new power plant rule that will force existing coal plants into premature retirement by 2032 or before, because they will have to either have committed to shut down in the 2030s, or they will have to incorporate carbon capture and storage on the plant, which is incredibly expensive and just destroys the economics of operating. So we're going to see in the US, and that rule, in addition to coal plants, all new natural gas plants by 2032 would have to incorporate carbon capture and storage. Well, when you think about this, this is going to upend the economics of operating these thermal power plants. And so this is radically changing the whole cost equation. So when you look at all these options, you're not going to build coal plants, as we just said. They're actually shutting them down. It's going to be more and more expensive to build natural gas. Large nuclear plants are great, and I think we should build tons of them. But after the recent experience in Georgia, in the US, where that plant was basically 7 years behind schedule and $17 billion over budget. Even in China, that particular design is called an AP1000. It takes, even in China, where they have a very sophisticated and experienced workforce and supply chain, it takes them over 9 years to build that particular design. So that's not going to happen anytime soon, right? And then you start looking at, well, what about wind and solar? Well, they need transmission. That's a dependency. In the transmission bottlenecks right now, it takes basically 10 plus years to build out new transmission, right? So even if you want to connect it, you can't. So that leaves small nuclear, advanced nuclear power plants is one of the most viable options. Now, there's plenty of challenges with nuclear, but by far, I mean, everything has challenges and trade-offs. But when you start looking at all of the other suboptimal options, it's starting to look really interesting from these large energy customers.
Tell us a little bit more about that. We hear just maybe the phrase, small nuclear or something like that, but not really a clear understanding. Maybe because nuclear itself was such a pariah for so many years, it wasn't part of the public conversation for a long, long time. But describe that. I mean, how big is that facility, and how many, homes or something could it power, that kind of thing?
Sure. Well, historically, there's been three big challenges to deploying and scaling nuclear power. The first is high upfront costs. The second is long build times. And the third is public perception of fear around waste and safety. So I'm going to unpack each of those and talk about how these advanced reactors, these advanced nuclear power plants, overcome those three historical barriers. So let's talk about cost. Well, a traditional large nuclear power plant is usually in the ballpark of 1,000 megawatts. Well, these smaller plants are on a whole different scale. So you're talking about things that are 10, 15 megawatts, 50 megawatts, maybe 100 megawatts. So already you've cut the scale down tremendously. And then there's new innovative business models that are coming to the market where no upfront capital is required from the customer, because you're able to sell the power as a service through a long-term, what's called a power purchase agreement. Now, this business models can transform industries. Think about Amazon Web Services, and what they did with compute as a service. until AWS launched, when you wanted to go build out more server capacity, if you were a Fortune 500 company, you had to go invest a bunch of capital to buy a bunch of servers, hire people to basically rack those servers, test those servers, operate those servers, ultimately replace those servers over time. And then all of a sudden, Amazon had this new business model that said, hey, you want more compute? Just plug in and you can run and you can buy this compute as a service. And Amazon didn't invent new servers to do this. It was a new business model. And that is what is going to happen in the nuclear industry. Because traditionally, the only people that were designing and building these big nuclear plants were these vendors that were licensing their designs to utilities. Well, now, because you're going much smaller and you have these new innovative financing mechanisms and new business models, you can go direct to the data center, direct to the factory, and sell that power as a service. You can co-locate these smaller plants right next to the data center or right next to the factory, or you can just be on the same grid. But it opens up a whole new array of options and really removes a lot of that high upfront cost. Now, the second was build time.
Yeah.
So because they're a lot smaller and a lot simpler to build, they're not massive mega infrastructure projects. You can, depending on the design and the company, et cetera, but some of the companies could even build these as fast as about 36 months from a signed power purchase agreement to turning on commercial power. Now, there are roadblocks. By no means I'm making this sound easy. And the first ones are taking longer than that. But there is a path to getting these going in about 3 years, I would say, 3 to 4 years, once you kind of get through the initial regulatory hurdles, because a lot of this is very scalable and repeatable because you're building a standardized product. You're not building a customized bespoke plant every time. So you can copy and paste 90% of that license application to the regulator that's licensing these things and stamp that out for all future plants. So that's how you're going to help on build time. And then the third is public perception. Well, a lot of these advanced new nuclear power plants designs, they're self-cooling and self-regulating, and some of them even recycle used nuclear fuel, meaning nuclear waste. So the two things that the public cares about, is it safe and what about the waste? Well, if you can't actually physically melt down the power plant or the fuel, and you don't even need backup power or human intervention because it's self-cooling and self-regulating, there is no risk, health risk to the public. Even if there is a natural disaster, even if a commercial airliner were to crash into it, even in every worst case possible scenario, the plant would go offline, obviously in an emergency, but it's just going to cool off on its own using natural forces, things like gravity, thermal expansion, and airflow, right? So that takes care of that safety concern. And then on the waste side, a lot of people view nuclear waste as this huge problem. Now, I would argue that even today, it's not a huge problem. It's never hurt any human. No commercial nuclear waste has hurt anyone. It's perfectly safe sitting there. However, over 90% of the energy is still in that spent fuel that we can recycle and turn into new fuel to power these advanced reactors. So it's a tremendous opportunity. I would argue nuclear waste is a gift to future generations because we can extract that energy and turn it into new energy. We can, for example, in the United States, we can power the United States of America for the next 150 years just extracting the energy that's sitting in the used fuel right now. So anyways, those are kind of the three historic challenges and how some of these advanced reactors are overcoming them.
To what degree do you feel that education or lack of is an obstacle? Because as you say, I mean, man, we're still talking about, stuff that had Chernobyl, and there's nothing similar to Chernobyl in any of the newer nuclear plants, the big ones, let alone the small nuclear reactors. But you got to do a lot of education. And again, you have big blowback from environmental groups, or some environmental groups, despite the irony of their concern about climate change, and they can't come up with a better solution. But I'm just wondering, do you see that shifting? Because I can see that kind of protest scene still.
I mean, imagine if we applied the same kind of thinking to other industries. I mean, if you were making a phone in, let's say, the 1970s, you have a rotary phone that obviously has none of the compute
Yeah.
capacity we have today. Compare that to like a modern smartphone or iPhone or something like that. I mean, that's a similar analogy of what we're talking about with the sophistication of advanced nuclear technology today. You can't compare it to something that was built in the 70s. It was perfectly safe in the 70s, though. I mean, in the United States, as an example, there's been one commercial nuclear accident in 70 years
Hmm.
of operation. One. Think of another industry, another chemicals, auto, whatever. You name an industry that has a track record that is this good from an occupational health and worker safety perspective, as well as a public health impact. That one accident had zero health impact on the surrounding community, zero. The amount of radiation that actually was released was the equivalent of you or I going into the Rocky Mountains and going for a hike or taking a flight going across the
Hmm.
Atlantic. So there wasn't any negative health impact. I mean, think of another industry that has a safety track record as good as that. I mean, we deal with all
Yeah.
kinds of industrial chemicals and things that are very hazardous all the time in various industries. And the nuclear industry is incredibly safe, and these newer advanced designs
Yeah.
are even that much better.
If you were going to close your eyes and look out 10 years, would you kind of think this is going to be commonplace because of the very things you just alluded to in terms of, companies have a choice. If they can't get the power, they can't grow. Huge growth in AI, is happening, but is coming. And again, they need a power source and maybe one that's unique to themselves if it's a major company, all of those things. So do you see that demand resulting in this major, major change that you're describing here? And I say I take a 10-year time frame to allow for various things.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to predict the future.
Yeah.
Obviously, no one has a crystal ball here, but I think it's pretty safe to say when we look out, let's say 10 to 15 years into the future, after we've solved some of these shorter term issues on the licensing and supply chain, that I would imagine when you have a large energy customer like a data center or a factory, I think every data center, let's say over 15 megawatts in size, that's not right in a downtown area, is going to have an advanced nuclear power plant right there next to it, right? Because it just makes so much sense. They can get their 24/7 clean energy. They have enhanced resiliency and reliability right there. And ultimately it's going to be cheaper, right?
Yeah.
Because and once we solve some of these supply chain bottlenecks, you're going to be able to start scaling these things and stamping them out like a factory product.
Yeah.
So I think that may be in a 15-year time frame, but I think this is going to be incredibly common over the course of that kind of time frame to see this kind of co-located solution next to these large energy customers.
I can't help the investor in me sees uranium, because, I don't think that part of the supply chain is ready. I mean, the price has been reflecting some of that, but it's not close to what this expansion, I think, will look like too. I mean, they got a choice. So they want to solve some of these problems, especially, clean air, et cetera, the power shortages, all that, there's not a better solution out there.
Well, the uranium fever is spreading, right? I
Yes.
mean, we've seen 233% increase in the price over the last 5 years, from 2019 to 2024, in the price of uranium, and that's all on this positive sentiment. Is the world is waking up and
Yeah.
embracing nuclear power? Now we're just in the very beginning of this. I mean, we haven't barely started in terms of the scale that we're going to hit. And so, yeah, there's going to be some bottlenecks and in some challenges, but also think about this. Like I said, there's some of these advanced reactors are going to be able to embrace recycled spent fuel as well. And there's a lot of resource to be mined out of that. So it's not all fresh fuel. It's all not, I mean, we're going to need a lot of mining. Don't get me wrong. And uranium is going to be scarce, but there's optionality in terms of how do we harness energy from that resource, both in recycled material as well as fresh material.
Well, I tell you, it's exciting, and I so much appreciate you finding time. And I love the website. I love the Twitter account at Brian Gitt, and Gitt is spelt with Gitt, two T's, simple, at Brian Gitt. And as you say, this is an evolving field and something that's, well, with exciting results, but it also is a good reason to keep up to date with it. And Brian, just know how much we appreciate you finding time for us. And I already put you on the hook. We're coming back at you, baby. So,
well, happy to come back anytime. And if
okay.
people want to learn more, they can go to my personal website, briangitt.com.
Yeah.
And they can get the book. They could read the book for free electronically. And again, I give it away at basically cost of printing and shipping. So hopefully that's useful. And I really appreciate these conversations and getting the word out.
I really recommend the book, The Dark. As you say, you can read it electronically, but it's Brian didn't do it to make money, did it to help with our education. So it's very inexpensive, but I really enjoyed it. I thought it was very valuable. I can't say better than that. So Brian, thank you for taking the time. Great to chat with you.
Thank you.